Have you ever felt like thinking too much can feel like a prison? While some people live without questioning things so deeply, others analyze everything. The meaning of life, people's actions, the injustices of the world, and even their own thoughts. And the more they understand, the more they realize that reality can be much heavier than it seems. But does that mean being intelligent makes you suffer more? In this video, we are going to reflect on that question with the help of great thinkers from Western and Eastern philosophy, to understand whether intelligence is a curse, a blessing, or simply a deeper path to seeing life. For Schopenhauer, intelligence is not only a light that illuminates life, it is also a blade that cuts through illusions. In The World as Will and Representation, he presents a deeply uncomfortable view of existence. Behind our choices, dreams, ambitions, and emotions, there is a blind, constant, and insatiable force, which he calls the will. This will is not simply the conscious desire to have something. It is a deeper impulse, an energy that pushes us to want, to search, to achieve, to fear losing, and then, after achieving something, to desire something else again. This is where intelligence begins to become painful. The more conscious a person is, the more they notice this repetitive movement. They see that much of human life looks like a race where the finish line keeps moving. A person wants something, believing that once they reach it, they will finally find peace. But when they get it, the satisfaction does not last long. Soon, a new lack appears, a new anxiety, a new comparison, a new restlessness. Schopenhauer describes this dynamic by saying that life swings between pain and boredom. When we desire, we suffer because something is missing. When we finally get it, pleasure fades and emptiness returns. A less reflective person may live through this cycle without seeing it so clearly. They suffer, but often interpret their suffering as an isolated problem. Lack of money, lack of recognition, lack of love, lack of luck. But the more intelligent person, in the Schopenhauerian sense, begins to see a larger pattern. They realize that it is not just about solving one specific problem, but about dealing with a structure that belongs to existence itself. Pain does not appear only because something went wrong. It appears because, for Schopenhauer, to desire already means to feel that something is missing. This awareness can be heavy. The intelligent person realizes that many of the pleasures that drive society are fragile, temporary, and sometimes illusory. They see people competing for status, seeking approval, collecting things, pretending to be secure, trying to look happy, while carrying silent fears inside. And the hardest part is this: they recognize that same mechanism within themselves. It is not only the world that is trapped by desire, they are trapped too. Clear awareness does not place them outside the human condition. It only allows them to see the chains more clearly. That is why, in Schopenhauer, thinking too much can become a form of silent suffering. Not because intelligence is a mistake, but because it removes certain veils. What once seemed simple begins to reveal deeper layers. A victory stops being just a victory. It begins to carry the question, what comes after this? A pleasure stops being just pleasure. It reveals how brief it is. An ambition stops seeming so grand. It may look like just another attempt to fill an emptiness that always returns. Intelligence, in this sense, does not create pain. It simply prevents pain from being hidden so easily. Schopenhauer also observes that human beings suffer more than animals precisely because they have more awareness. An animal feels pain, hunger, and fear, but it lives in a more immediate way, tied to the present. Human beings, on the other hand, suffer because of a past that cannot be changed, a future that has not yet arrived, possibilities that never happened, and comparisons that may not even be real. The mind expands existence, but it also expands suffering. Memory brings old wounds back to life. Imagination anticipates tragedies. Reason notices contradictions. Intelligence turns a temporary pain into reflection, and reflection can make that pain last much longer. But it is important not to reduce Schopenhauer to a simple defense of pessimism. He is not just saying, in a shallow way, that life is suffering. He is trying to show that there is a deep relationship between awareness and pain. The more someone sees, the less they can completely deceive themselves. And for him, much of ordinary happiness depends on some degree of illusion, believing that the next achievement will solve everything, that the next love will cure all loneliness, that the next recognition will finally bring peace. Philosophical intelligence doubts these promises. Even so, Schopenhauer does not completely abandon the possibility of relief. He sees art, aesthetic contemplation, and compassion as ways to temporarily suspend the rule of the will. When someone contemplates a work of art, listens to a profound piece of music, or loses themselves in the beauty of nature, for a few moments they stop wanting to possess, win, or control. They simply observe. They simply contemplate. In that moment, intelligence does not serve to increase restlessness, but to notice something beyond personal desire. The pain does not disappear forever, but it weakens for a moment. Compassion also plays an essential role. When an intelligent person realizes that everyone is trapped in the same cycle of desire and suffering, they may fall into contempt or isolation. But Schopenhauer points to another path, recognizing in others the same fragility that exists within oneself. Clear awareness, then, does not have to become arrogance. It can become tenderness. Someone who deeply understands human pain does not use that awareness to feel superior, but to judge less, understand more, and act with more humanity. Schopenhauer's great lesson is that intelligence increases pain when it makes us aware of the permanent dissatisfaction that moves life. But that same intelligence can also stop us from living as slaves to false promises. It shows us that not every desire deserves obedience, not every ambition deserves sacrifice, and not every feeling of restlessness needs to be followed. Thinking can hurt because it reveals the hidden structure of suffering. But when guided well, this thought can also open space for a life with fewer illusions, more compassion, and more honesty in the face of the human condition. In Buddhist teaching, suffering does not begin simply because someone thinks too much. It is born when the mind clings to what passes, to what it wants to possess, to what it fears losing, and to what it tries to control. This difference is essential. For the Buddha, intelligence itself is not a curse. The problem begins when intelligence becomes a tool of attachment. The mind can be a lamp that lights the path, but it can also become a prison when it starts repeating memories, anticipating fears, and creating needs that never end. In the Dhammapada, one of the best-known works connected to the Buddhist tradition, there is a central idea: the mind guides human experience. In other words, what we cultivate inside shapes the way we feel the world. If the mind is filled with desire, comparison, resentment, or fear, even simple situations become heavy. Two people can go through the same event, but suffer in very different ways, because it is not only the external fact that hurts. It is the mental relationship we create with it. That is why, in Buddhism, suffering is not only found in the unavoidable pain of life. Loss, aging, frustration, goodbyes, and change are part of existence. Pain naturally appears when something difficult happens, but suffering becomes stronger when the mind refuses to accept the movement of life. A person suffers not only because they lost something, but because they keep trying to possess it internally. They suffer not only because the future is uncertain, but because they demand impossible guarantees. They suffer not only because the past happened, but because they insist on living inside it. An intelligent person may suffer more precisely because they have a greater ability to build mental scenarios. They can imagine possibilities, analyze consequences, review conversations, predict risks, and interpret signs. This can be useful, of course, The problem begins when this ability stops serving clarity and starts feeding restlessness. An intelligent mind, without inner training, can create very sophisticated mazes. It finds reasons to remain trapped, arguments to keep fear alive, and explanations for not letting go of what should have already been left behind. Attachment to the past is one of these silent forms of suffering. A person revisits what they said, what they did not say, what they should have done, what they could have avoided. Intelligence then becomes a kind of inner court. Everything is re-evaluated, judged, and condemned. The past stops being a memory and turns into a sentence. The Buddha does not teach that we should erase memory or pretend nothing happened. The point is different. Remembering is not the same as clinging. Learning from the past is wisdom. Mentally repeating the same wound is attachment. There is also attachment to the future. In this case, suffering is born from the attempt to control what has not even arrived yet. The mind creates plans, then fears they will fail. It creates expectations, then becomes anxious about the possibility of disappointment. It creates an ideal image of happiness, then turns the present into something insufficient. A person begins to live as if peace were always somewhere later, after achieving something, after being recognized, after solving every problem, after having absolute certainty. But absolute certainty rarely comes. And while it does not come, real life keeps being postponed. The Dhammapada also connects attachment with sadness and fear. The idea is simple and deep. What we hold tightly begins to hold us back. When someone places all their peace in a person, in an outcome, in approval, or in an image of themselves, they begin to live threatened by loss. The more the mind says, "This must be mine," the more it fears that the world will answer, "This can change." Attachment turns good things into sources of anxiety, because nothing impermanent can offer complete security. Here is one of the great differences between desire and wisdom. Desire is human. Buddhism does not ignore the fact that we have wants, preferences, and affections. But when desire becomes psychological dependence, it begins to control life. A person no longer chooses freely. They react out of fear of losing, out of a need for approval, out of a craving for control. In this state, intelligence does not free them. It only works to protect attachment. Instead of asking, "Is this healthy?" it asks, "How can I make sure this never slips away from me?" The restless mind also suffers because it cannot rest in the present. It is always somewhere else. In what happened, in what might happen, in what others think, in what is missing, in what feels threatening. And when the mind is never fully where the body is, even ordinary life loses its flavor. Eating, walking, talking, breathing, resting, everything becomes background noise for inner worries. The Buddha proposes the opposite path, observing the mind, recognizing its movements, and not automatically obeying every thought that appears. This observation is not passivity. It is clarity. When a person realizes they are attached, they gain the possibility of not being controlled by that attachment. They can notice fear without becoming fear. They can recognize desire without becoming its slave. They can remember the past without staying trapped in it. They can plan for the future without turning the future into the owner of their peace. This is a deeper kind of intelligence than the simple ability to think. It is the ability to see thought without completely confusing oneself with it. That is why, in the Buddhist view, thinking too much becomes suffering when thinking means clinging. Clinging to a memory, an expectation, an identity, a hurt feeling, a person, an answer, a certainty. A mind that clings becomes rigid. The mind that observes begins to free itself. The Buddha does not invite human beings to be less intelligent, but to be less imprisoned by their own minds. True wisdom is not found in analyzing everything to the point of exhaustion, but in realizing when thought has stopped lighting up life and has started darkening it. There is a kind of suffering that does not come from a concrete tragedy, but from an open door. It may sound strange, because we usually connect anxiety with something that has gone wrong. But for Kierkegaard, in the concept of anxiety, anxiety appears precisely when human beings realize they can choose. It is not only the weight of what has already happened. It is the trembling before what may still happen. The mind looks at life and understands. There are paths, decisions, risks, consequences. And when this awareness becomes too intense, thinking begins to hurt. Kierkegaard understands anxiety as something different from fear. Fear usually has a clear object. Fear of losing someone, fear of failing, fear of being rejected, fear of a specific situation. Anxiety, however, is deeper and less clear. It appears in the face of possibility. It is like standing before an abyss, not necessarily because someone is pushing you, but because you realize there is space, choice, freedom. That is why he speaks of anxiety as a kind of dizziness of freedom. A person feels dizzy not because they are trapped, but because they realize they are not completely trapped. This point is essential for understanding why thinking too much can create suffering. The more a person reflects on their own life, the more they realize that their choices are not neutral. Choosing one career is, in a way, giving up others. Staying in a relationship means refusing other possible futures. Saying yes to one direction means saying no to many alternatives. Even not choosing is already a form of choice. Awareness notices this and begins to weigh every action as if it carried an entire destiny. A deeply conscious person does not suffer only because of what they choose, but also because of what they leave unchosen. They imagine parallel lives, alternative versions of themselves, outcomes that could have happened if they had spoken differently, waited longer, left earlier, or accepted another opportunity. Intelligence, in this case, expands the field of possibilities. And the larger the field of possibilities becomes, the greater the sense of responsibility can feel. Thought stops being only analysis and becomes inner pressure. Kierkegaard writes from a context deeply marked by the question of individual existence. For him, living is not simply following ready-made rules or repeating the path of the majority. Each person must become themselves through the choices they make. This sounds freeing, but it is also frightening. Because being free means not being able to hand your life completely over to chance, society, family, or outside expectations. Even when someone hides behind what everyone else does, there is still a choice there, the choice to hide. This is where anxiety reveals its strength. It shows that the human being is not a stone, not a machine, and not an animal guided only by instinct. A human being can reflect, imagine, refuse, change, fall, and begin again. This openness is powerful, but it is also unsettling. Someone who thinks deeply realizes that there is no absolute guarantee before taking action. No important decision comes with perfect certainty. Life demands movement before all the answers are available. And this is exactly what the anxious mind struggles to accept. Excessive thinking tries to turn life into a safe equation. A person wants to predict every consequence, control every reaction, remove every risk. But human choices do not work that way. Something always escapes. There is always an unknown part. There is always the possibility of regret. So the mind begins to circle around the decision, as if thinking a little more could finally remove all uncertainty. However, in many cases, thinking too much does not bring clarity. It only increases the noise. In the concept of anxiety, Kierkegaard does not treat anxiety only as a weakness. It can also be a sign of depth. Only someone who realizes their own freedom feels anxiety in this sense. Anxiety shows that the person is facing themselves, facing the power to choose, facing the responsibility of existing. It is uncomfortable because it reveals that life cannot be lived only on autopilot. The problem begins when a person tries to escape this anxiety in a desperate way, becoming paralyzed, delaying everything, blaming themselves for everything, or searching for a certainty that never comes. Think of someone who needs to make an important decision. From the outside, it may seem like a simple choice. But inside, that person sees many layers. What if I regret it? What if I disappoint someone? What if I am betraying who I am? What if this decision changes everything? The intelligent mind is able to see real consequences, but it can also exaggerate imagined possibilities. In this way, freedom becomes a burden. Life, which could be a path, starts to feel like a judgment. Kierkegaard helps us understand that anxiety should not simply be destroyed as if it were a worthless enemy. It needs to be understood. There is an anxiety that paralyzes, but there is also an anxiety that awakens. It reminds us that our choices matter. It prevents us from living completely numb. It reveals that there is something serious about being human. The challenge is not to allow this awareness to become a prison. The way out is not to stop thinking, nor to live irresponsibly. It is to accept that choosing always involves risk. A person can reflect, seek honesty, consider consequences, and listen to their own conscience. But at some point, they need to act. Maturity does not mean having absolute certainty before every step. It means walking with responsibility, even knowing that existence never gives us total control. In this way, Kierkegaard shows that thinking too much hurts when the mind turns freedom into a threat. Awareness of possibilities can open new horizons, but it can also create anxiety when every path seems to carry infinite weight. Still, this anxiety does not have to be only suffering. It can be a sign that a person is waking up to the seriousness of their own life. The danger is not realizing that we are free. The danger is standing still before freedom, as if living were possible without choosing. In the Tao Te Ching, wisdom does not appear as an attempt to dominate everything, explain everything, or defeat everything. It appears as the ability to notice the rhythm of things and move with it, without turning every situation into a battle. In this view, suffering often comes from a mind that insists on pushing life in the direction it wants, even when reality is showing another path. This idea is connected to the concept of the Tao, which can be understood as the way, the natural flow, the deep order that runs through all things. The Tao is not something that can be controlled by force. It is not a formula that the mind captures and uses as a tool. It is more like the course of a river. It moves, bends, adapts, and keeps going without hurry and without violence. Whoever tries to hold the river with their hands becomes frustrated. Whoever learns to navigate, it suffers less. Lao Tzu does not condemn intelligence. What he questions is hardened intelligence, the kind that believes living well means calculating every step, predicting every answer, and controlling every consequence. This kind of mind is always armed. It does not rest because it sees life as a threat. When something changes, it resists. When something escapes the plan, it panics. When someone acts differently than expected, it tries to correct, pressure, or manipulate. In this way, thought stops being wisdom and becomes constant tension. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu values the principle of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, but that translation can be confusing. Wu Wei does not mean laziness, passivity, or giving up on life. It means acting without forcing. It is action that arises at the right moment, in the right measure, without excessive anxiety and without violence against the nature of things. It means doing what is necessary without trying to crush reality with your own will. This lesson is deep because many people suffer not only because of the problem they are facing, but because they resist the fact that the problem exists. A person does not suffer only because a situation has changed. They suffer because they keep repeating inside, "It was not supposed to be this way." They do not suffer only because someone is pulled away. They suffer because they try to force life back into its previous shape. They do not suffer only because a plan failed. They suffer because their identity was attached to that plan. For Lao Tzu, part of human pain comes from this refusal to flow. An overly calculating mind wants to turn existence into predictable territory. It creates maps for everything: how other people should act, when success should arrive, how the future should unfold, what kind of recognition it should receive. But life rarely obeys with such precision. And when reality does not fit the map, the person suffers as if the world were wrong, when perhaps the map has simply become too narrow. There is a quiet strength in flexibility. The Tao Te Ching uses images from nature to show this. Water, for example, is soft, but it wears down stone. It is humble because it takes the lowest places, yet nothing can live without it. This image reveals a wisdom that goes against rigidity. What is rigid may look strong on the outside, but it breaks easily. What is flexible may seem fragile, but it resists change much better. An intelligence that learns from water does not need to defeat everything by force. It finds a way through. This does not mean accepting everything without discernment. Lao Tzu does not teach blind submission or conformity in the face of injustice. The point is different: to act without being consumed by the need for control. A person can make decisions, set boundaries, seek improvement, and face difficulties without turning their mind into a battlefield. The problem is not action itself, but acting out of desperation, as if everything depended on the absolute imposition of one's own will. When intelligence mixes with rigidity, it begins to produce suffering, even in simple situations. A conversation becomes a battle over who is right. A change becomes a personal threat. A mistake becomes proof of failure. A period of waiting becomes torture. The person cannot simply live the experience. They need to dominate it, label it, predict what will happen next, and make sure nothing escapes their control. Over time, this attitude exhausts the body, hardens the heart, and weakens the relationship with the present. Lao Tzu proposes a kind of wisdom that is lighter and at the same time deeper. He suggests that the answer is not always to do more. Sometimes it is to interfere less. Clarity does not always come from thinking until exhaustion. Sometimes it comes from quieting the excess noise inside. The path does not always open through pressure. Sometimes it appears when we stop pushing against the same door and notice another opening beside it. This view is especially important for those who confuse intelligence with control. Many people believe that if they are attentive enough, strategic enough, and rational enough, they will avoid all pain. But this expectation creates another kind of suffering, the feeling of being responsible for controlling what was never fully in their hands. Lao Tzu gently breaks down this illusion. Living well is not about controlling every wave. It is about learning not to drown when the sea moves. Taoist wisdom reminds us that there is a difference between direction and rigidity. Having direction means walking with awareness. Being rigid means demanding that life move exactly as the mind imagined. Having intention is healthy. Clinging to the result as the only acceptable version of reality is suffering. Intelligence matures when it understands this difference. It stops trying to command the flow and begins to listen to it. For Lao Tzu, then, thought only becomes heavy when it moves away from simplicity. The mind that forces everything lives tired because it is always trying to correct the world. The mind that learns to flow does not abandon responsibility, but it acts with less inner violence. It notices when to move forward, when to wait, when to yield, when to stand firm, and when to let go. And perhaps this is one of the rarest forms of intelligence, not the kind that dominates life, but the kind that knows how to live without fighting against everything that changes. Plato places before us a powerful image: men chained inside a cave, looking only at shadows projected on the wall, believing those shadows are all of reality. This scene, presented in Book 7 of the Republic is not only a metaphor about ignorance, it is also a reflection on the price of clear awareness. For Plato, knowing the truth is not a peaceful walk toward the light. It is a difficult, uncomfortable, and often lonely process. In the allegory of the cave, the prisoners have always lived looking at distorted images. Because they have never seen anything else, they confuse appearance with truth. This detail is essential. They do not know they are mistaken. For them, the shadows are the world. Plato is saying that human beings can live trapped in opinions, customs, speeches, and illusions without realizing they are imprisoned. The mind gets used to what is familiar, even when what is familiar is false. When one of the prisoners is freed, his first reaction is not joy. He feels pain. His eyes cannot bear the light. What should set him free initially hurts him. Plato describes this movement as a difficult climb, where the individual must leave the comfort of the shadows behind and adjust to the brightness. This reveals a deep truth. Not every form of awareness arrives as relief. Sometimes seeing more clearly hurts because it destroys what once gave us a sense of safety. In this sense, intelligence can increase suffering because it breaks with innocence. When someone begins to think more deeply, they realize that many certainties were only repeated habits. They realize that some opinions that seemed to be their own were inherited from family, society, culture, or the fear of disagreeing. They realize that not everything popular is true, not everything that looks bright has value, and not everything that brings comfort is fair. This realization can be freeing, but it can also create a feeling of displacement. Plato suggests that the path of knowledge requires a turning of the soul. It is not just about collecting information. Leaving the cave means changing the direction of one's gaze. Before, the person saw only what was immediate, physical, talked about by everyone, and apparently obvious. Later, they begin to search for causes, foundations, principles, and deeper truths. This change does not happen without resistance, because the human mind is attached to what it knows. Many times, we prefer a comfortable illusion over a demanding truth. This point is very relevant today. The cave does not have to be imagined only as a physical place. It can be formed by vanity, public opinion, consumerism, appearance, ideologies, social media, fear of thinking differently, or the need for approval. A person can be surrounded by information and still remain trapped in shadows. They can repeat ready-made phrases, defend ideas they have never examined, and live to appear rather than to understand. Plato warns us that the most dangerous kind of ignorance is the one that presents itself as certainty. But the suffering of the person who leaves the cave does not end when they see the light. There is an even greater pain, returning and trying to speak to those who remain chained. In the allegory, when the freed man returns, his eyes no longer adjust well to the darkness. The other prisoners see him as confused, strange, perhaps even dangerous. They do not want to leave the shadows behind, because the shadows are everything they know. Here, Plato shows that clear awareness can isolate a person. Those who understand reality more deeply do not always find immediate acceptance. When they question collective illusions, they may be seen as inconvenient. When they point out contradictions, they may be called pessimistic. When they reject appearances, they may seem arrogant to those who still confuse appearance with truth. Plato knew this very well. In the Apology of Socrates, also written by him, Socrates is condemned precisely because he questions false certainties and disturbs the city with his search for truth. So the philosopher does not suffer only because he sees more, but because he lives among people who may not want to see. This pain does not mean that truth is bad. It means that the passage from illusion to awareness requires rupture. When someone realizes they were living trapped in a false image of themselves, of a relationship, of a desire, or of society, there is a kind of grief involved. The person loses a simpler version of the world. They lose the innocence of believing that everything is exactly as it seems. They lose the comfort of fully belonging to common sense. This is the price of a clearer vision. In the Republic, Plato connects this climb to the role of education. To educate is not simply to put knowledge inside someone, as if the soul were an empty container. It is to guide the gaze toward what is more true. That is why real education can be uncomfortable. It does not only confirm what we already think, it challenges us. It forces us to ask, is this true, or is it only convenient? Do I think this way because I understand, or because I got used to it? Could what I am calling reality be only a shadow? For Plato, intelligence suffers when it realizes the distance between the world of appearances and the world of truth. The clear-minded person begins to notice how much people can attach themselves to praise, images, small disputes, and false needs. They see the crowd arguing over shadows as if they were substance, and at the same time, they must deal with their own responsibility. After seeing more, they can no longer pretend they did not see. That is why leaving the cave is painful, but staying inside, it comes with an even greater cost. The pain of truth is a pain of growth. The pain of illusion is a prison disguised as comfort. Plato shows us that thinking deeply can hurt because it pulls the soul out of passivity. But that wound also opens the eyes. And perhaps this is what makes clear awareness so difficult. It no longer allows us to live only on shadows, even when the shadows seem easier to bear. Zhuangzi observes a very subtle kind of suffering, the kind that appears when the mind turns life into a permanent problem to be solved. Unlike an obvious pain, such as a loss or a disappointment, this suffering shows up through overanalysis, through the need to compare everything, judge everything, and find a final explanation for every event. In the Zhuangzi, one of the central texts of Taoism, wisdom is not found in gaining intellectual control over the world, but in recovering a more spontaneous, light, and flexible relationship with existence. For Zhuangzi, reality is wider than our concepts. The human mind tries to divide the world into rigid categories, right and wrong, success and failure, gain and loss, useful and useless, superior and inferior. These divisions can help in practical situations, but they become dangerous when we start believing they capture the whole truth. Life changes, circumstances shift, perspectives vary. What looks like defeat in one moment may later reveal itself as a lesson. What seems useless to one person may be precious to another. Suffering begins when the mind demands that everything fit into a fixed definition. This is one of Zhuangzi's deepest criticisms of excessive judgment. A person who analyzes too much rarely just lives in experience. They compare. While having a conversation, they wonder whether they were interesting enough. While resting, they feel guilty for not being productive. While achieving something, they measure whether it is bigger or smaller than what others have achieved. While suffering, they ask whether they should suffer less, whether they are reacting well, whether they should be stronger. In this way, the experience is never lived directly. It goes through a mental court before it is even fully felt. From the Taoist perspective, this attitude takes away lightness because it creates an artificial distance between the person and the natural flow of life. Zhuangzi values spontaneity, not as uncontrolled impulsiveness, but as harmony between action and the moment. The overly calculating mind tries to arrive before life itself. It wants to predict every reaction, avoid every mistake, and control every impression. But by doing this, it loses the freedom to respond naturally to what is right in front of it. One of the best-known passages in the work is the dream of the butterfly. Zhuangzi dreams that he is a butterfly flying freely, and when he wakes up, he asks whether he was Zhuangzi dreaming he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming it was Zhuangzi. This image should not be read only as a poetic curiosity. It questions the rigidity with which we defend our identities and certainties. Who am I? What is reality? What is appearance? Zhuangzi does not offer a closed answer, because the very desire to trap everything inside an answer may be part of the problem. This kind of wisdom does not humiliate reason, but it puts reason in its proper place. Thinking is necessary. Reflection can help us avoid mistakes, expand our vision, and deepen life. The problem begins when intelligence becomes attached to total understanding. The person cannot accept that some things are ambiguous, that some questions remain open, that some phases need to be lived through without an immediate explanation. They want to name the pain before feeling it, control love before living it, define the future before walking into it. This need for explanation may look like maturity, but often it is fear disguised as clarity. Zhuangzi also criticizes comparison because it disconnects us from the uniqueness of things. When everything is measured by an outside standard, nothing can simply be. The crooked tree is seen as useless because it cannot become straight wood. The quiet person is judged as weak because they do not impose themselves like others. A simple life seems small because it does not fit the social model of greatness. But Zhuangzi often turns this way of seeing upside down. What the world calls useless may be exactly what escapes exploitation, pressure, and exhaustion. What does not serve the desire for control may serve freedom. At this point, intelligence that compares too much becomes suffering because it turns life into a constant competition. It is not enough to be. One must be more. It is not enough to live. One must prove that they live better. It is not enough to think. One must have the most brilliant answer. The mind never rests because it always finds someone who seems more successful, more admired, more confident, more beautiful, more intelligent, or happier on the surface. Zhuangzi invites us to question this measuring stick. Perhaps peace is not found in winning every comparison, but in giving up the need to measure ourselves all the time. Another important teaching appears in the figure of the skilled craftsman or cook, as in the story of Cook Ding. He does not act through brute force or excessive calculation. His skill comes from such a deep connection with what he does that the action seems to flow naturally. This example shows that true intelligence is not tense. It does not need to show off or impose itself. It appears as calm precision, as presence, as the ability to follow the movement of things without forcing them. This idea is powerful for anyone trapped in too many thoughts. Many times, a person believes that non-stop thinking is a sign of depth. But Zhuangzi would ask, does this thought bring you closer to life or push you away from it? Does it bring clarity or does it only multiply judgments? Does it help you act better or does it paralyze you? Does it make room for spontaneity or does it turn every gesture into self-pressure? The mind can be a companion, but it can also become a room full of voices arguing while life happens outside. Lightness, in Zhuangzi, is not superficiality. It is a higher form of wisdom. Only someone who does not need to carry the weight of explaining everything, winning everything, and controlling everything can be truly light. A light person is not someone who ignores the complexity of life, but someone who does not allow that complexity to destroy their ability to breathe, laugh, adapt, and keep going. They understand that not every question needs to become anxiety. Not every difference needs to become judgment. Not every uncertainty needs to be treated as a threat. In this way, Zhuangzi shows us that thinking too much can be a way of losing contact with the real world. Intelligence becomes painful when it turns into mental rigidity, constant comparison, and an obsessive search for explanations. But when it learns to be flexible, quiet, and attentive, it stops feeling heavy. The mind does not need to abandon thought. It needs to abandon the prison of wanting to capture all of life inside thought. Existence is greater than our categories, and perhaps wisdom begins exactly when we stop squeezing the world so tightly and learn to move with it more naturally. Socrates did not become known for offering ready-made answers, but for breaking down easy answers. In the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato, he appears before the judges of Athens, trying to explain why his life had become so uncomfortable for the city. The formal accusation involved corrupting the youth and not recognizing the traditional gods. But behind that, there was something deeper. Socrates disturbed people because he made them realize they did not know as much as they thought they did. The central point of his wisdom is exactly there. Socrates does not present himself as the owner of truth. On the contrary, his intelligence is born from the awareness of his own ignorance. When the oracle of Delphi says that no one was wiser than him, Socrates becomes intrigued. To test this statement, he begins to speak with politicians, poets, and craftsmen, people recognized as wise by Athenian society. What he discovers is uncomfortable. Many of them knew something in specific areas, but believed they knew much more than they actually did. This discovery reveals an essential difference between true knowledge and false confidence. The ordinary ignorant person simply does not know. But there is a more dangerous kind of ignorance, not knowing and believing that you know. This is the second form that Socrates fights against. For him, the first step of intelligence is not collecting beautiful opinions, deep phrases, or convincing speeches. The first step is having the courage to admit, maybe I am wrong. This phrase seems simple, but it can shake an entire identity. Recognizing your own ignorance hurts, because it wounds pride. Many people build their image on certainties. The certainty that they are fair, intelligent, correct, mature, superior, or well-intentioned. When someone questions these certainties, it does not feel only like a discussion of ideas. It feels like a personal threat. Socrates understood this. His questions did not attack only arguments. They touched the vanity hidden behind them. In practice, the Socratic method worked like an investigation. He would ask, what is justice? What is courage? What is virtue? What is piety? A person would answer with confidence. And Socrates would ask new questions, showing contradictions, gaps, and confusion. Little by little, what seemed clear began to fall apart. This process is painful because it takes away the ground from those who are used to living supported by superficial definitions. But this pain is not destructive by nature. It can be an inner cleansing. Socrates did not question people in order to humiliate them, although many felt humiliated. He questioned because he believed that an unexamined life was not worth living in a fully human way. In the Apology, this idea appears as one of the strongest marks of his philosophy. Living well requires examining yourself. It is not enough to exist, work, obey, desire, win arguments, or follow traditions. We must ask whether what we call life is truly guided by truth and virtue. Here is the connection between thought and suffering. Someone who begins to think in a Socratic way loses the peace of easy certainties. They can no longer repeat an opinion just because everyone repeats it. They can no longer call something right just because it is convenient. They can no longer hide so easily behind excuses. Awareness becomes more demanding. It asks, do I really know this, or did I just hear it? Do I believe this because I reflected on it, or because I am afraid to disagree? Am I truly fair, or do I only want to seem fair? This kind of intelligence can create discomfort because it forces us to look inside without makeup. Many times, we discover that our convictions are mixed with vanity, resentment, the desire for approval, or simple habit. A person who thinks deeply does not suffer only because of the ignorance of the world. They suffer when they realize their own confusion. Socrates teaches us that the greatest illusion is not only outside us, in social appearances, but also inside us, in the ease with which we confuse opinion with truth. At the same time, this awareness of ignorance is freeing. Whoever admits they do not know everything becomes able to learn. False certainty closes the mind. Intellectual humility opens the way. Socrates does not defend passive ignorance, as if it were better not to search for anything. He defends conscious, active, restless ignorance, one that asks, investigates, and refuses to pretend to be wise. True intelligence, then, is not arrogant. It is humble, but not weak. It is humble because it recognizes limits. It is strong because it is not satisfied with lies. This teaching is especially important in a world full of quick opinions. Today, many people feel pressured to have an answer about everything: politics, morality, success, happiness, relationships, spirituality, the future. Admitting doubt seems like a sign of weakness. Socrates would reverse this logic. For him, worse than doubting is living trapped inside a certainty that has never been examined. Honest doubt can be the beginning of wisdom. Vain certainty may be only ignorance dressed well. That is why Socratic intelligence does not offer immediate comfort. It removes masks. It dismantles inner speeches. It shows that maybe we are not as clear-minded as we think. But it also gives us something precious: the possibility of a more truthful life. When someone recognizes that they do not know everything, they stop defending every opinion as if it were part of their own body. They begin to listen better, ask better questions, learn better, and judge more carefully. Socrates turns thought into an exercise in honesty. To know is not to possess all the answers, but to realize the distance between what we imagine we know and what we truly understand. This realization can be painful because it destroys the illusion of superiority and places us once again in the position of learners. But perhaps this is exactly where a deeper intelligence begins, not in the pride of appearing wise, but in the quiet courage of not lying to yourself. For Confucius, wisdom is not a private brightness of the mind. It does not exist only to make someone more educated, more eloquent, or more admired. In the Analects, a collection of teachings attributed to the Chinese master and preserved by his disciples, true intelligence is connected to the formation of character. To know more, in this sense, means to carry more responsibility. The more someone understands what is good, the harder it becomes to pretend they do not know what they should do. This is an important difference from a purely intellectual view of intelligence. For Confucius, it is not enough to have quick reasoning, a strong memory, or the ability to argue well. A brilliant mind without virtue can become dangerous, because it knows how to justify its own interests with great skill. Confucian wisdom asks something more demanding. Has knowledge made you a better person? Has your intelligence helped make your relationships more fair, more respectful, more human? Or has it only strengthened your vanity? In the Analects, one central figure is the Junzi, often translated as the noble person or the exemplary person. The Junzi is not noble because of birth, wealth, or social appearance, but because of conduct. This person seeks to improve themselves, cultivate sincerity, act with integrity, and treat others with respect. This shows that, for Confucius, intelligence reaches its highest form only when it becomes moral responsibility. Knowing what is right and not acting according to it is a deeper failure than simply not knowing. This is where thinking too much can become painful. Someone who sees the consequences of their actions more clearly can no longer live in complete innocence. A harsh word no longer seems like just an emotional outburst. It begins to be seen as something that can hurt a relationship. An omission no longer seems neutral. It may be understood as cowardice. An advantage gained at someone else's expense no longer seems clever. It begins to reveal a flaw in character. Moral awareness increases the weight of choices. Confucius gives great attention to human relationships. Family, friendship, government, education, respect for elders, care for the young, loyalty, sincerity, and duty are not secondary themes in his thought. For him, ethical life happens first in the way we treat those close to us. It is no use speaking about great ideals while acting carelessly, arrogantly, or coldly in daily relationships. Virtue is not a beautiful theory. It is a repeated practice in everyday life. This makes intelligence more demanding. A conscious person cannot use ignorance as an excuse forever. If they understand that their actions affect others, they must answer for that. If they understand that their words have power, they must speak more carefully. If they realize that their presence influences their family, friends, or community, they must ask what kind of influence they are having. Confucian wisdom does not allow us to completely separate what a person thinks from the way they live. In the Analects, there is a recurring idea. Personal improvement begins with oneself, but it does not end with oneself. The individual educates themselves in order to live better with others. This view prevents intelligence from becoming proud isolation. It is not enough to feel superior because you can see the flaws in the world. The Confucian question would be, what are you doing to correct the flaws in yourself first? Clear awareness that only judges others is still incomplete. Mature awareness becomes inner discipline. This process can feel heavy because it requires consistency, and consistency is difficult. Many times, we know what would be more fair, but we choose what is easier. We know we should apologize, but pride gets in the way. We know we should act with patience, but we prefer to win the argument. We know we should be honest, but convenience tempts us. The greater our moral awareness, the less room there is for comfortable excuses. Intelligence reveals the distance between what we admire and what we actually practice. Confucius does not treat this distance with despair, but with continuous work. Virtue does not appear as a perfect state reached all at once. It is cultivated. A person corrects themselves, learns, observes their own mistakes, improves their speech, refines their actions, and educates their desires. Wisdom is found in this constant effort to become more whole and upright. It is not a search for theatrical perfection, done to impress others, but a quiet responsibility before one's own conscience. There is also a very strong social aspect. For Confucius, when a person fails morally, that failure does not remain trapped inside them. It spreads through relationships. An indifferent child weakens the family. An unjust ruler brings disorder to the people. A disloyal friend destroys trust. A vain person contaminates the environment with competition and resentment. That is why understanding the good brings weight. Our choices are not as isolated as we would like to believe. At the same time, this responsibility should not be seen only as a burden. It also gives dignity to life. If our actions matter, then our moral effort has value. An honest word can restore trust. A respectful gesture can protect a relationship. A fair action can keep selfishness from becoming the rule. For Confucius, intelligence that becomes virtue helps bring harmony to the world around us, beginning with the closest bonds. The pain of moral awareness is born precisely from this realization. Living well requires more than understanding high ideas. It requires presence, self-control, respect, and commitment. Someone who understands this can no longer treat their own conduct as something small. Every choice begins to carry an intimate question. Am I acting according to what I know is right? This question may be uncomfortable, but it also guides us. In Confucius, true intelligence is not the kind that only understands the good, but the kind that accepts the challenge of practicing it even when no one is watching. Nietzsche enters this theme as a restless voice, almost like someone walking against the wind. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he presents Zarathustra as a figure who comes down from the mountain after years of solitude, trying to speak to people about a higher, freer, and more creative way of life. But it soon becomes clear that seeing beyond common values does not mean being understood. For Nietzsche, clear awareness can open the eyes, but it can also separate a person from the crowd. Zarathustra is not only a philosophical character. He represents the individual who has begun to question ready-made truths. He looks at dominant morality, accepted customs, repeated beliefs, and asks, did this truly come from the strength of life or did it come from fear? This question is dangerous because it shakes everything that most people prefer to leave untouched. Many people live more peacefully when they follow inherited values without examining them. But the clear-minded person struggles to obey simply because everyone else obeys. In Nietzsche, intelligence suffers when it realizes that much of social life is built on masks. People call something virtue when it is often weakness in disguise. They call something humility when it may be fear of growing. They call something kindness when, in some cases, it hides resentment. They call something truth when it is only an old custom. This vision does not make life simpler. On the contrary, it creates a painful distance between those who see the hidden structures and those who prefer to keep living inside them. One of the central points of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the criticism of the so-called last man. The last man represents the comfortable human being who desires comfort above greatness, safety above creation, and peace above depth. He does not want to overcome himself. He only wants to avoid risks. He does not want to turn his own existence into a work of art. He only wants to remain comfortable. For Nietzsche, this kind of life may look happy on the outside, but it carries an inner poverty. The person no longer desires anything great, no longer bears the weight of a deep question, no longer wants to create values, only consumes small satisfactions. Someone who thinks deeply may feel isolated precisely because they can no longer be satisfied with this shallow life. Ordinary conversation may seem repetitive. Social ambitions may seem small. Praise may feel empty. Collective certainties may seem fragile. The person looks around and realizes that many people want to belong more than they want to understand. They want approval more than truth. They want to be accepted more than to become what they truly could be. This realization can create loneliness, because deep questioning often means losing the comfort of belonging without conflict. But it is important not to turn Nietzsche into a defense of arrogance. He is not simply saying that the clear-minded individual should despise everyone. Nietzsche's criticism is more complex. He denounces the herd mentality, but not to create an empty vanity that says, "I am better than others." For Nietzsche, true superiority is not found in feeling above the crowd, but in having the courage to overcome yourself. The danger is using intelligence only to judge, without creating anything new. Clear awareness that only despises is still trapped in resentment. Zarathustra seeks something more difficult, the transformation of life. He does not only want to destroy old values. He wants to open space for the creation of new values. This requires solitude, because creation requires distance from the noise. Someone who only repeats the opinion of the group does not need to be alone with themselves. But someone who wants to think authentically must endure silence, doubt, and misunderstanding. In Nietzsche, solitude is not only abandonment, it can also be an inner workshop. The famous idea of the death of God, developed by Nietzsche in the Gay Science and echoed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is not only a religious provocation. It points to the fall of the absolute certainties that once supported the meaning of life in the West. When these certainties lose their strength, human beings find themselves facing an emptiness. If the old values no longer convince us, who will create new values? The clear-minded person suffers because they notice this emptiness before others do. They understand that many people keep repeating words they no longer truly believe, simply because they are afraid of what would come after. This clear awareness can be heavy. After all, it is easier to live with ready-made answers. It is more comfortable to say, "This is right because it has always been this way," than to ask whether that always truly deserves obedience. It is safer to follow dominant morality than to take responsibility for thinking with your own mind. But Nietzsche shows that a truly human life requires this risk. It is not enough to exist as an echo. You must become the author of your own existence. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the idea of overcoming appears. The human being is not a final destination, but a bridge. This image is powerful because it shifts the focus. The problem is not only suffering because you think too much. The problem is thinking and not transforming that clear awareness into creation. Intelligence that only notices decay can fall into cynicism. But intelligence that moves through solitude can create strength, style, courage, and an affirmation of life. Nietzschean solitude, then, should not be seen only as a punishment. It is also the price of not living completely domesticated. Someone who questions deeply may feel distant from common values, but that distance can allow for a wider vision. Not every solitude is a failure. Some forms of solitude are the necessary space for a person to stop being only repetition and begin becoming creation. Nietzsche leaves us with an intense lesson. Clear awareness can isolate because it breaks the easy connection with the crowd. But this isolation only becomes empty when it turns into bitterness. When it becomes creative courage, it stops being only pain and becomes a path. Thinking beyond common values hurts because it takes a person out of the shelter of collective certainties. But for Nietzsche, perhaps it is precisely outside that shelter that the possibility begins for a life that is more authentic, stronger, and more faithful to what we can still become. There are moments when suffering does not come from the outside, but from the noise that forms within. A person may be sitting down, apparently safe, but inside, the mind is running as if it were trying to escape from something. It thinks about what happened, what might happen, what should have been said, and what still needs to be solved. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali looks at this inner movement and points to a simple and deep truth. When the mind is agitated, the experience of life becomes confusing, heavy, and painful. Right at the beginning of the Yoga Sutras, one of the most famous ideas in the yoga tradition appears. Yoga is the stilling of the movements of the mind. This phrase should not be understood as an invitation to destroy thought or become empty inside. Patanjali is not saying that thinking is wrong. The problem is not the existence of the mind, but the uncontrolled power of its disturbances. When thoughts, fears, memories, desires, and judgments take control, a person stops living reality as it is and begins living inside the interpretations the mind creates. This distinction is essential. There is the situation itself, and there is the story the mind creates about the situation. Someone takes too long to answer a message, and the mind already invents rejection. A mistake happens, and the mind turns it into proof of inability. A challenge appears, and the mind predicts failure before action even begins. Suffering grows because the person is no longer dealing only with the present. They are dealing with an inner multiplication of scenarios, fears, and rushed conclusions. Patanjali calls these mental movements vrittis. They are movements of the mind that can take different forms: correct perception, error, imagination, sleep, and memory. The point is not to treat all of this as an enemy, but to notice how these movements can trap us when there is no discernment. Memory, for example, can teach, but it can also imprison. Imagination can create, but it can also feed anxiety. Intelligence can understand, but it can also get lost in endless analysis. This is where intelligence without inner discipline becomes suffering. An intelligent mind can notice details, make connections, anticipate consequences, and interpret subtle signs. This can be a strength, but without stability, that same ability becomes restlessness. The person does not only think, they ruminate. They do not only plan, they become anxious. They do not only analyze, they disconnect from the present. Thought stops being a tool and becomes a tyrant. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali also speaks about the obstacles that disturb the inner path, such as doubt, carelessness, laziness, distraction, instability, and suffering. These states do not appear as moral failures that condemn a person, but as movements that need to be observed and worked through. The untrained mind tends to jump from one object to another. It seeks stimulation, then becomes tired. It seeks certainty, then finds doubt. It seeks pleasure, then fears losing it. Without direction, it becomes an unstable field where any outside wind can create a storm. In this context, anxiety can be seen as a mind that has lost its closeness to the present moment. The body is in the present, but awareness is scattered. One part in the past, another in the future, another in other people's opinions, another in possibilities that may never happen. The person tries to live in many moments at the same time, and that is exhausting. Patanjali reminds us that peace is not born from controlling the entire world, but from learning to quiet our inner relationship with the world. This stillness does not appear by chance. It requires practice. In the Yoga Sutras, paths such as discipline, detachment, concentration, meditation, and discernment appear. Discipline here is not cruel rigidity against oneself. It is care. It is the decision not to let the mind run alone in any direction. Just as an instrument needs to be tuned to produce good music, the mind needs to be trained to perceive clearly. Without this, even a brilliant intelligence can produce a confused life. Detachment is also fundamental. Patanjali shows that many disturbances are born from attachment to pleasure, aversion to pain, fear, and excessive identification with the ego. When a person believes that every thought is an absolute truth, they suffer more. When they believe that every emotion defines who they are, they lose freedom. When they believe they need to control every answer life gives, they turn existence into tension. Detachment does not mean indifference. It means not being dragged away by everything that appears inside the mind. There is a deep difference between observing a thought and obeying it. The mind may say, "This is going to go wrong." But observing that thought allows you to ask, "Is this reality, or is it just fear?" The mind may say, "I will never be able to do this." But trained awareness notices, this is a conclusion, not a fact. This inner distance is a form of freedom. Patanjali does not teach us to run away from the mind, but to stop being confused by it. That is why living in the present is not just a beautiful phrase or a shallow idea. For Patanjali, presence is a spiritual and psychological achievement. It is the ability to be fully present in what we are doing without being constantly dragged away by the past, the future, and comparison. A present mind is not a mind without intelligence. It is a mind that has learned to use intelligence with serenity. Patanjali shows us that suffering increases when the mind becomes a place without order. Too many thoughts without direction create anxiety. Too many memories without processing create imprisonment. Too many desires without discernment create dependence. But when the mind is observed, disciplined, and gently guided, it stops being a constant source of disturbance and becomes a path to clarity. True intelligence, in this sense, is not thinking nonstop. It is knowing when thought serves life and when it only increases the distance between us and the present. Camus begins where many philosophies try to look away, in the clash between the human desire for meaning and the silence of the world. In the myth of Sisyphus, he does not present the absurd as a distant theory, but as an intimate, almost everyday experience. The absurd appears when a person realizes that their mind searches for order, purpose, explanation, and direction, but existence does not always offer a clear answer. Human beings ask, "Why?" and the world often remains silent. This realization does not necessarily come in dramatic moments. Sometimes it appears on an ordinary morning, in the middle of the repetition of daily life, when a person asks why they do what they do. Working, rushing, desiring, completing tasks, seeking recognition, aging, repeating habits, waiting for something that may never come. Suddenly, what once seemed normal loses its clarity. The routine begins to feel strange. The world remains the same, but consciousness has changed. Camus calls this feeling of strangeness the encounter with the absurd. In this context, intelligence suffers because it can no longer accept automatic answers. It looks at ready-made explanations and realizes that many of them were only used to cover up the emptiness. Some people protect themselves by saying that everything happens for a clear reason, that every suffering has an obvious purpose, that there is always a hidden answer behind every event. Camus is harsher. For him, reality does not always confirm our hopes. The world is not organized simply to satisfy our need for meaning. But the absurd is not only in the world, and it is not only in the human being. It is born from the confrontation between the two. On one side, human consciousness wants clarity. On the other, reality does not give absolute guarantees. It is as if we carry within us a thirst for meaning, but stand before a source that does not promise to satisfy it. That is where the pain of clear awareness comes from, realizing that there may not be a final answer capable of closing every question. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus uses the figure of Sisyphus, condemned to push a rock up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down and begin the effort again. The image is powerful because it reflects the repetition of human life. All of us, in some way, push rocks. Responsibilities, desires, obligations, projects, hopes, failures, new beginnings. With every achievement, another climb appears. After every rest, a new demand comes. The absurd mind notices this cycle and asks, is this all there is? That question can hurt deeply. Someone who thinks little may distract themselves with the next task, the next purchase, the next pleasure, the next promise. But someone who thinks clearly begins to see the mechanism. They realize that many goals work like mirages. They seem final before being reached, but become insufficient afterward. Success does not eliminate restlessness. Pleasure does not last forever. Other people's approval does not solve inner loneliness. Life keeps demanding movement, even when the mind wants a final answer. However, Camus does not turn this awareness into simple despair. This is the great strength of his philosophy. He argues that recognizing the absurd does not have to lead to giving up on life. On the contrary, it can open a more honest form of freedom. When a person stops demanding that the world deliver a ready-made meaning, they begin to realize that they can live without bowing down to false certainties. The absence of a final answer does not necessarily destroy life. It can return to human beings the responsibility of living it intensely. This freedom is demanding because it does not offer easy comfort. Camus does not say, "Do not worry, everything will be explained in the end." He also does not say that we should pretend the absurd does not exist. His proposal is to remain clear-minded, not to run into illusions, not to numb our awareness, not to deny the conflict. For Camus, to live is to keep our eyes open, even before a world that does not answer the way we wish it would. Here is an important turning point. If life does not come with a ready-made meaning, that does not mean it is empty in every moment. It means meaning cannot be treated as a universal formula, handed to us from the outside. It can be born from lived experience, from creation, from love, from friendship, from art, from revolt, from the beauty of a moment, from the courage to keep going despite the lack of guarantees. Camus values this inner revolt, not accepting being crushed by the absurd, but also not lying in order to escape it. Camusian revolt is not empty shouting. It is a posture of dignity. It is saying, I see the lack of an answer, but I continue living consciously. It is recognizing the rock, the climb, the repetition, and still finding a way to affirm one's own presence in the world. That is why, at the end of the myth of Sisyphus, Camus suggests that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because his task has stopped being heavy, but because he becomes greater than his fate by recognizing it without bowing inwardly. This happiness is not euphoria. It is not superficial joy. It is a sober freedom, one when a person stops waiting for a perfect justification before beginning to live. Clear awareness does notice the absurd, yes, and this can isolate, disturb, and hurt. But it can also free us from dependence on false answers. Camus teaches us that thinking deeply does not have to end in paralysis. Intelligence can look at the silence of the world and, instead of destroying itself because of it, turn that silence into a space for creation. In this sense, the absurd does not close life off. It strips life bare. It removes the decorations, the easy promises, the rushed explanations. What remains is an existence without absolute guarantees, but still full of presence, choice, and intensity. The clear-minded person suffers because they can no longer believe in just any comfort. But they also gain a rare strength, the strength to live without needing to lie to themselves. On the battlefield of Kurukshetra, Arjuna does not suffer because of ignorance. He suffers because he understands too much. This detail makes the Bhagavad Gita a deeply human work. Arjuna's conflict is not the conflict of someone who does not know what is happening. It is the conflict of someone who understands the moral weight of what he is about to do. Before him are teachers, relatives, friends, and people connected to his own story. War does not appear as a glorious adventure, but as a terrible decision filled with consequences. This is the point where knowledge becomes a burden. Arjuna looks at the battlefield and realizes that no choice seems clean. If he fights, he will cause destruction. If he does not fight, he will abandon his duty as a warrior and allow injustice to advance. He is not facing a simple choice between good and evil. He is facing a real dilemma, the kind where every path seems to demand a price. And the more his awareness sees the moral layers of the situation, the more paralyzed he feels. In the Bhagavad Gita, this suffering appears as an inner crisis. Arjuna loses his firmness, his mind becomes confused, his body reacts, and his will grows weak. This scene reveals something powerful. Intelligence, when it faces a deep moral problem, can stop being clarity and become conflict. Thinking too much, in this case, does not only mean ruminating over small worries. It means seeing the size of a responsibility and feeling unable to carry its weight. Many people imagine that wisdom always brings immediate peace. The Gita shows the opposite. Sometimes awareness first arrives as disturbance. Someone who does not think may act out of impulse, blind obedience, or convenience. But someone who understands the consequences of their actions feels the weight of choice before acting. Arjuna suffers because he knows that his actions do not end with him. They move through families, duties, histories, and the balance of society. He realizes that to act is to interfere with the world. Krishna, then, does not offer Arjuna a shallow answer. He does not simply say, "Do not think about it," or "Do whatever you want." His teaching leads Arjuna toward a deeper form of discernment. The question is not to eliminate action, but to purify the inner relationship with action. Krishna shows that running away from duty out of fear of suffering can also be a form of attachment. Sometimes a person calls their hesitation kindness, when in reality they're trying to escape the pain of deciding. This point is delicate. The Bhagavad Gita does not teach moral indifference. Arjuna is not advised to act coldly, as if nothing matters. On the contrary, he is led to better understand his position, his duty, and the nature of right action. Wisdom is not about erasing sensitivity, but about preventing sensitivity from becoming paralyzing confusion. Feeling the weight of a decision is human. Being destroyed by that weight is the danger. One of the most well-known teachings of the work appears when Krishna says that human beings have the right to action, but not absolute control over the fruits of action. This idea, connected to chapter 2, verse 47, is central to understanding detachment. Detachment does not mean acting carelessly. It means doing what must be done with as much awareness as possible, without turning the result into property of the ego. A person acts responsibly, but accepts that they do not control every consequence. Here is one of the great lessons of the Gita. Suffering increases when we want a perfect guarantee before acting. We want to know if everything will work out, if no one will suffer, if we will be understood, if the result will confirm our intention. But moral life rarely offers that kind of certainty. There are moments when we need to act with discernment, even without having total control over the future. Balance is found in uniting clarity, beauty, and detachment. Arjuna represents anyone who has ever felt divided between what they feel, what they fear, and what they know they need to do. Sometimes being intelligent means realizing that a right decision can still hurt. Apologizing can hurt. Setting a boundary can hurt. Breaking away from injustice can hurt. Taking on responsibility can hurt. Maturity does not remove the pain of certain choices. It prevents that pain from making us cowardly or unaware. In the view of the Bhagavad Gita, knowledge without balance can become torment because the mind gets trapped between analysis and fear. The person sees all sides, considers every consequence, feels every possible loss, but cannot move. Krishna leads Arjuna beyond this paralysis. He teaches that wisdom is not only understanding the complexity of life, but finding a right way to act within it. This requires inner discipline. A mind dominated by ego acts in search of reward, approval, or personal victory. A mind dominated by fear avoids action in order not to suffer. But a mind guided by discernment asks, what is the right action, considering my responsibility in this moment? This question does not make everything easy, but it makes action cleaner. It shifts the center of decision, from the desire for control to faithfulness to duty. That is why the Bhagavad Gita does not treat detachment as an escape from the world, but as a freer way of being in it. To act without attachment to the fruits is to act without being a slave to vanity, fear, and the need for recognition. It is to do the best possible, with awareness, and let go of the illusion that we can command every effect of life. Arjuna finds strength when he understands that he does not need to act from desperation, but from clarity. His pain does not disappear because the problem has become simple. It changes because his relationship with the problem changes. Before, Arjuna was trapped between the fear of acting and the horror of the consequences. Afterward, he begins to understand that there is a difference between responsibility and absolute control. Responsibility is doing what must be done with awareness. Absolute control is an illusion that imprisons us. Intelligence, then, only increases suffering when it reveals deep dilemmas without offering inner direction. But when united with discernment and detachment, it becomes a path of maturity. The Bhagavad Gita shows that knowing more is not enough. We must learn to act better. Because there are moments when thinking reveals the weight of life, but only wisdom teaches us how to carry it without losing our soul. In Notes from Underground, the main character is not someone simple, naive, or unable to think. On the contrary, he thinks too much, observes too much, interprets too much. But this awareness does not lead him to freedom. It traps him in a cycle of doubt, resentment, wounded pride, and inaction. The so-called underground man is one of the most disturbing figures in philosophical literature because he sees many things clearly, but he cannot turn that clarity into life. He sees human contradictions, distrusts promises of progress, mocks optimistic ideas about reason and happiness, breaks down other people's intentions, and above all, breaks himself down. The problem is that this intelligence becomes corrosive. It does not build a path. It only digs his isolation deeper. Dostoevsky shows us that there is a difference between awareness and wisdom. Awareness is noticing. Wisdom is knowing what to do with what you notice. The underground man has the first, but never reaches the second. He understands his weaknesses, but uses that understanding as an excuse to remain inside them. He recognizes his contradictory impulses, but turns that contradiction into his identity. He knows he is trapped, but begins to speak of the prison as if it were a form of superiority. This is one of the most dangerous signs of thinking too much. The mind begins to justify its own paralysis. A person analyzes their possibilities so much that none of them seems pure enough. They think so much about the consequences that every action feels risky. They examine their own motives so deeply that they no longer trust any of them. Before acting, they stop themselves. Before speaking, they imagine how they will be judged. Before trying, they anticipate the humiliation of failure. In this way, intelligence, which could open doors, becomes an inner lock. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky also exposes resentment as a form of sick intelligence. The character does not only suffer, he turns his pain into an accusation against the world. He feels despised, misunderstood, diminished. But instead of moving beyond himself, building relationships, or acting with courage, he takes refuge in a kind of bitter superiority. Because he cannot fully take part in life, he begins to despise those who do. Because he cannot act with simplicity, he calls other people's simplicity stupidity. This mechanism is deeply human. Sometimes, when someone feels unable to live something, they begin to despise what they desire. Someone who cannot love without fear may say that love is an illusion. Someone who cannot try may say that trying is naive. Someone who cannot get close to others may say that people are shallow. Resentment protects a person from the pain of admitting their vulnerability, but it comes at a high cost. It turns the heart into a permanent defense. Dostoevsky understands that excessive awareness can create an inner division. The individual observes himself as if he were outside himself. He does not simply feel an emotion. He analyzes the emotion while feeling it. He does not simply have a conversation. He evaluates every word, every gesture, every possible interpretation. He does not simply make a mistake. He turns the mistake into proof of a deep flaw. This constant self-awareness blocks spontaneity. The person becomes a spectator of their own life. The underground man suffers because he knows too much about his intentions, but not enough to free himself from them. He is able to see that he acts out of vanity, pride, fear, a desire for recognition, and the urge to hurt before being hurt. But instead of using this perception to change, he sinks deeper into it. Clear awareness without courage becomes self-sabotage. The person begins to say, "This is just how I am," as if understanding the problem were the same as overcoming it. This is a powerful lesson for anyone who confuses depth with paralysis. Thinking deeply does not mean being trapped in an endless maze of suspicion. Not every doubt is a sign of intelligence. Sometimes doubt is only fear dressed in philosophical clothing. Not every criticism is a sign of superiority. Sometimes criticism is only resentment trying to look like clarity. Not every form of self-awareness is maturity. Sometimes looking inward too much without direction makes a person lose contact with the world. Dostoevsky does not offer an exemplary character to imitate, but an uncomfortable mirror. The underground man reveals what happens when intelligence separates itself from action, humility, and love. He thinks, but does not give himself to life. He analyzes, but does not transform. He judges, but does not commit. He wants to be seen, but fears exposure. He desires connection, but sabotages closeness. His tragedy is exactly this distance between noticing life and being able to live it. Awareness, when healthy, should make us more truthful, not more immobile. It should reveal our contradictions so we can work through them, not so we can turn them into a home. Dostoevsky shows that thinking too much becomes a curse when the mind loses moral and existential direction. Intelligence, by itself, can break down illusions, but without courage, it does not build a way out. The great warning of Notes from Underground is that clear awareness can become sick when it feeds only on itself. Thinking needs to find movement. Recognizing a wound needs to lead to some kind of care. Seeing a weakness needs to open space for a different choice. Otherwise, the mind becomes an underground, a place where everything is analyzed, everything is justified, everything is resented, but almost nothing is truly lived. In the art of war, intelligence appears as the ability to read reality, to observe before acting, measure the forces involved, recognize risks, avoid unnecessary conflicts, and win, when possible, without destroying. This is an important shift within our theme. While many thinkers show how clear awareness can increase the weight of existence, Sun Tzu reveals another side. A well-guided mind can prevent suffering that would be born from impulsiveness, vanity, and recklessness. For Sun Tzu, war is not a display of blind courage. It is an extreme situation, costly, dangerous, and full of consequences. That is why the best strategist is not the one who enters every battle to prove strength, but the one who knows when to fight, when to step back, when to negotiate, when to wait, and when to avoid confrontation. One of the most famous ideas attributed to the work is that supreme excellence consists of winning without fighting. This phrase summarizes a deep wisdom. Not every conflict needs to reach the point of destruction. Applied to everyday life, this view is powerful. Many people suffer because they confuse intelligence with immediate reaction. Someone provokes them, and they respond in the heat of pride. Tension appears, and they turn everything into a dispute. Criticism comes, and they go to war to defend their image. But Sun Tzu would invite us to ask, does this battle really need to be fought? What will be lost if I win? What will be destroyed if I insist on being right? Sometimes, winning an argument can cost a relationship, peace, an opportunity, or even our own serenity. Strategic intelligence begins with observation. Before acting, it is necessary to understand the terrain. In the art of war, the terrain is physical. Mountains, rivers, distances, weather, and the position of armies. In life, the terrain can be emotional, social, family-related, professional, or psychological. There are moments when a person is too tired to make a decision. There are conversations that should not happen at the height of anger. There are environments where honesty needs to come with prudence. There are conflicts that only grow because someone entered them without understanding the context. This does not mean cowardice. For Sun Tzu, avoiding an unnecessary battle is not weakness. It is intelligence. The reckless person fights to prove something. The wise person fights only when there is a real need and a real possibility of handling the situation with clarity. Many human pains are born from the inability to distinguish between these two things. A person can spend years trapped in disputes that no longer make sense, trying to convince someone who does not want to listen, seeking recognition from someone who never offered respect, trying to control situations that call for distance. To think strategically is to realize where your energy is being wasted. Another essential principle in Sun Tzu is knowing yourself and knowing the other. This idea is often remembered as one of the foundations of victory. But in a philosophical sense, it is also a protection against suffering. Someone who does not know themselves enters conflicts driven by pride, fear, neediness, or anger, while believing they are being rational. Someone who does not know the other person misreads intentions, underestimates risks, overestimates alliances, and exposes themselves unnecessarily. A lack of self-knowledge makes every decision more dangerous. To know yourself is to know where you are vulnerable. It is to notice which words throw you off balance, which situations awaken your vanity, which fears make you accept what you should not accept, and which desires make you insist where you should have already stopped. Without this awareness, a person becomes easy to manipulate. All someone has to do is touch the right wound, provoke the right pride, promise the right reward, and that person enters a battle they did not freely choose. Sun Tzu teaches that strategy is also inner mastery. Knowing the other, on the other hand, does not mean living suspicious of everyone. It means observing with maturity. Some people are open to dialogue, and some people turn dialogue into a trap. Some conflicts can be solved with clarity, and some conflicts only feed more confusion. There are moments when speaking helps. In others, silence protects. There are situations where insisting is courage. In others, it is only attachment in disguise. Practical intelligence knows how to make these distinctions. Thinking too much, in the negative sense, creates mazes. Thinking well, in the strategic sense, creates paths. This difference is fundamental. The unbalanced mind anticipates problems until it becomes paralyzed. The strategic mind predicts risks in order to reduce damage. The anxious mind imagines tragedies without direction. The wise mind identifies possibilities and prepares responses. Sun Tzu does not teach us to suffer over every imaginable threat, but to see enough to act with precision. That is why his philosophy is so useful for dealing with emotional conflicts. Many times, suffering grows because a person enters every dispute as if all of them were decisive. They wear themselves out over small comments, useless rivalries, empty comparisons, and a constant need to explain themselves. But a life guided by strategy learns to choose its battles better. Not every provocation deserves an answer. Not every opinion deserves defense. Not every apparent loss is a defeat. Not every retreat is a failure. Sun Tzu also shows that true victory is not impulsive. It is prepared. This applies to a difficult conversation, an important decision, a boundary that needs to be set, or a life change. Acting without preparation may look like courage, but often it is only haste. A balanced mind does not react only to the impact of the moment. It considers consequences. It evaluates the cost. It looks for the right time. It knows that the way we act can be just as important as the action itself. Sun Tzu's great contribution to this reflection is showing that intelligence does not have to be a sentence to suffering. It can be an art of avoiding damage. When properly guided, thought does not become a useless burden, but practical clarity. It helps us recognize when to move forward, when to wait, when to speak, when to stay silent, when to insist, and when to leave. Pain increases when the mind is dominated by pride and reaction, but it decreases when awareness becomes strategy, balance, and discernment. In the art of war, true intelligence is not found in proving strength at any cost. It is found in preserving energy, avoiding destruction, and acting with precision. This lesson goes far beyond the military field and touches all of life. Many battles that seem urgent are only traps for our peace. To think well is to learn to recognize them before they consume us. Freedom, when seen from a distance, seems like a beautiful promise. It sounds like autonomy, choice, possibility, and the power to decide your own path. But Sartre reveals the heavier side of this word. In being and nothingness, freedom does not appear only as a privilege. It appears as an unavoidable responsibility. For him, the human being cannot simply escape choosing. Even when someone tries to run away, even when they stay silent, even when they obey, even when they say, "I had no choice," they are still, in some way, choosing a way to exist. That is why Sartre says that the human being is condemned to be free. The phrase seems contradictory, but it carries the center of Sartrean existentialism. We are condemned because we did not ask to exist, we did not choose to be born, and we do not control all the circumstances around us. But once we are thrown into the world, we are forced to take a position before it. We do not choose all the conditions of life, but we do choose what to do with them, how to interpret them, and what direction to give our actions. This awareness can be distressing. A less reflective person may live by leaning on ready-made explanations. I am this way, because my family is this way. I do this because everyone does it. I do not change because life does not allow it. This is just my personality. Sartre does not ignore that there are real limits, social contexts, pressures, and concrete difficulties. But he insists on something uncomfortable. We are not only products of our circumstances. There is always some degree of response, attitude, and choice. And realizing this takes away the comfort of an absolute excuse. At this point, intelligence increases the weight of freedom because it makes it harder to pretend innocence. When someone understands that their decisions build their own identity, every choice begins to carry more weight. It is not only about choosing a profession, a relationship, an opinion, or a behavior. It is about choosing who you are becoming through those decisions. For Sartre, there is no ready-made essence before existence. First we exist. Then, through our actions, we define ourselves. This idea is powerful, but also uncomfortable. If there is no ready-made script that completely determines who we are, then we cannot transfer all responsibility to a fixed nature, to destiny, or to an outside order. With every gesture, we are saying something about ourselves. With every renunciation, too. With every silence, every commitment, every escape, every act of courage. Life stops being only something that happens to us and becomes something in which we are involved. Sartre calls bad faith the attempt to escape this responsibility. Bad faith happens when a person lies to themselves, pretending to be something fixed, without freedom, without choice, without the possibility of acting differently. It is the individual who hides behind a social role and says, "I am only this." It is the person who reduces themselves to a function, a past, a trauma, or someone else's expectation, as if nothing could be questioned. Bad faith is comfortable because it lightens the weight of deciding, but it comes at a cost. The person gives up their own authenticity. The problem is that clear awareness notices this escape. It knows when it is using an excuse. It knows when it is accepting a life it does not want because it is afraid of facing the consequences. It knows when it calls something prudence that may actually be cowardice. It knows when it calls something destiny that may actually be a repeated choice. This kind of clarity hurts because it places the individual face to face with themselves without so many disguises. Sartrean freedom is also heavy because it does not come with guarantees. To choose is always, in some way, to choose in the dark. No one receives absolute confirmation that they are doing the right thing. A person decides, acts, takes risks, and only later sees part of the consequences. This creates anxiety, not because freedom is bad, but because it places us before open possibilities. As in Kierkegaard, there is a dizziness before what is possible. But in Sartre, this dizziness takes on an even more radical dimension. There is no way not to choose. Even following the majority is a choice. Even obeying orders is a choice. Even remaining where you are is a choice. This is one of the harshest claims in Sartrean thought. He wants to stop us from treating our own lives as if we were objects pushed around by the world. The human being is not a chair, a stone, or a tool with a defined function. The human being is consciousness, project, openness. And this openness is frightening because it means we can always be held accountable for what we do with it. However, Sartre is not only condemning human beings to wait, he is also returning dignity to existence. If our choices matter, then we are not completely powerless. If our actions define us, then there is still room for transformation. If bad faith is an escape, authenticity is the courage to recognize, I am responsible for the way I respond to life. This responsibility does not remove pain, fear, or limits, but it prevents a person from living completely hidden. The awareness of freedom can be heavy, but it can also awaken us. It forces us to give up the fantasy that someone else will live for us. No tradition, group, authority, or excuse can fully replace the task of choosing. In Sartre, thinking deeply means realizing that every life is a signature still being written. And perhaps the true suffering is not only that we are free, but that we try to deny this freedom while it continues to follow us in every decision. Krishnamurti changes the direction of the question. For him, the problem is not thinking too much, but thinking from fear. In works such as The First and Last Freedom, he does not treat intelligence as simply the ability to reason, argue, or accumulate knowledge. A person can be educated, quick-minded, well-informed, admired by others, and still live trapped in deep conditioning. In Krishnamurti, true intelligence begins when the mind notices the mechanisms that imprison it. This prison has no visible bars. It appears in constant comparison, in the fear of not being enough, in the need for approval, in the repetition of the past, and in the desperate search for psychological security. A person believes they are thinking freely, but many times they are only reacting to memories, wounds, expectations, and models they received from family, society, religion, education, or culture. The thought seems new, but it is born from old patterns. For Krishnamurti, the conditioned mind suffers because it never finds rest. It is always trying to become something, more accepted, more admired, more secure, more successful, more spiritual, more intelligent, more loved. This movement of becoming creates constant tension. The person looks at themselves and thinks, I am not enough right now. I need to get somewhere in order to finally have value. In this way, the present becomes a waiting room, and life is lived as a future promise. Comparison is one of the most important points in his criticism. From an early age, human beings learn to measure themselves against others. They compare grades, appearance, talent, achievements, personality, status, maturity, happiness. This comparison seems normal, but it creates a silent wound, the feeling of always being above or below someone else. When someone feels above, pride is born. When someone feels below, inferiority is born. In both cases, the mind is not free. It is trapped by an outside measuring stick. Krishnamurti would say that this comparison prevents true self-knowledge. Instead of looking at themselves with direct attention, the person looks at themselves through others. They do not ask, what is really happening inside me? But how do I compare to them? This detail changes everything, because when the mind lives in comparison, it never truly meets itself. It only judges itself, corrects itself, condemns itself, or praises itself. Observation turns into conflict. Psychological fear also holds a central place. This is not only physical fear, which can protect life in the face of real danger. Krishnamurti speaks of another kind of fear, fear created by thought. Fear of failing, of being rejected, of losing status, of being alone, of not living up to an image, of repeating an old pain, of not reaching the imagined future. This fear feeds on psychological time. What happened yesterday and what may happen tomorrow? In this sense, the mind suffers because it carries the past as identity. A painful experience happens, and thought records it. Later, when faced with a similar situation, the mind reacts from that record. It does not see the new with fresh eyes. It sees the present through memory. In this way, the past continues to command. The person believes they are choosing freely, but many times they are only avoiding old wounds or trying to repeat familiar pleasures. Krishnamurti does not propose a mechanical technique to solve this. This is a radical part of his thought. He is suspicious of ready-made methods when they become another form of dependence. For him, it is not enough to follow an authority, repeat a formula, or adopt an external discipline without understanding. Freedom does not come through blind obedience. It comes through attentive observation of one's own mind. That is why his famous statement that truth is a pathless land expresses, well, this refusal to turn inner freedom into a universal recipe But observing does not mean analyzing endlessly. This is a delicate difference. Analysis can become another prison when the mind tries to explain everything from the past. The observation proposed by Krishnamurti is more direct. It is noticing fear as it appears, noticing comparison at the moment it happens, noticing the desire for approval as it moves within us, not to condemn it, justify it, or immediately control it, but to see it clearly. This clarity is already transformative. When the mind sees a conditioning deeply, without running away, something changes. For example, when someone realizes that their search for recognition is born from the fear of having no value, that perception can weaken the power of fear. Not because the person repeated a positive phrase, but because they saw the mechanism working. For Krishnamurti, intelligence is this light of perception. It does not increase suffering. It reveals the roots of suffering. That is why he moves away from the idea that thinking too much is necessarily a curse. The problem is conditioned thought, repetitive thought, thought driven by fear and comparison. A mind like this can turn anything into anxiety, a conversation, a choice, a memory, an expectation, a silence. But a mind that observes its own movements begins to discover another quality of intelligence, less connected to control and more connected to inner freedom. This freedom is not cold isolation, nor indifference toward life. On the contrary, Krishnamurti connects true intelligence with deep sensitivity. When the mind is not occupied only with itself, with its defenses, fears, and images, it can listen better, love better, and perceive better. The other person stops being only someone who confirms or threatens the ego. The world stops being only a stage where we try to prove our worth. Krishnamurti's great contribution is to show that authentic intelligence is not found in defeating every thought, but in understanding where thought comes from. The mind that sees its conditioning no longer needs to obey it automatically. It notices when it is repeating the past, when it is comparing itself, when it is seeking security in illusions. And in that perception, a rare possibility is born, to live with more attention, less fear, and less inner dishonesty. If this video made you think, leave a like, because it really helps the channel reach more people who also need to hear this message. Subscribe to the channel to keep following philosophical reflections like this, always with depth, clarity, and meaning. Share this video with someone who thinks too much, someone who carries many questions inside, or someone who may need to turn their clear awareness into strength. And write in the comments, for you, is thinking too much a curse or a way of seeing life more clearly? Thank you for watching until the end. Stay here on the channel because there are many other videos waiting for you. Reflections that can help you look at life, the mind, and yourself with more depth.